Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. The hum of the office had always been a comfort to me. A white noise symphony of ringing phones, soft conversations, and the rapid tapping of keyboards. I had worked at this tech company for nearly a decade, climbing from a junior developer to lead project manager. But that sense of stability I once cherished had begun to waver in recent months. My wife, Laura, had grown distant, and our conversations often felt like hollow echoes of what they used to be. It was something I couldn't quite put my finger on, a subtle, creeping shift that was more felt than seen. It was during this time that I first heard his name, Nathan Pierce. Laura mentioned him casually one evening over dinner, her tone light but with a trace of excitement that I hadn't heard in a while. Our company hired this consultant, Nathan, to overhaul the marketing systems, she said, twirling pasta around her fork. He's this young tech whiz who's already making waves. I nodded absently, not thinking much of it. Consultants came and went. The Silicon Valley grind meant there was always someone new, someone innovative, someone disrupting the old ways. What I didn't expect was how quickly his name would seep into our everyday life. Laura started talking about him more frequently, his ideas, his energy, his knack for solving problems. At first, I brushed it off as professional admiration. After all, she was passionate about her work. One day, Laura invited me to join her at her company's networking event. I agreed, hoping it would be a chance to reconnect and see her in her element. That's when I met Nathan. He was magnetic, I'll give him that. Tall and lean, with sharp features and an easy smile, he had a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He extended his hand to me, his grip firm, his gaze unwavering. "You must be Laura's husband," he said, his tone warm and casual. "She's spoken very highly of you." There was nothing overtly suspicious about him then, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his smile lingered a second too long when he looked at Laura, or the way her laugh seemed louder, freer, when he made a joke. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it. And maybe I wasn't. Not yet. As the evening wore on, I watched them from across the room, their heads bent close together over a glass of wine. They were laughing, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the event lights. It felt like I was on the outside of something intimate, something I wasn't meant to see. I tried to shake the feeling. This was my wife. She loved me. We'd built a life together. Whatever I was imagining, it couldn't be real. But in the weeks that followed, that distance between us only grew. Laura started coming home later, her excuses thin and hurried. Late meetings, she'd say. Big project deadlines. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, now seemed glued to her hand. She'd step outside to take calls, her voice low and hushed. One night, as she slipped into bed beside me, the faint scent of cologne clung to her skin. It wasn't mine. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but a part of me was terrified of what I might uncover. Instead, I buried my suspicions and told myself I was being paranoid. After all, she'd never given me a reason to doubt her before. Yet, the seed of uncertainty had been planted, and it was beginning to take root. And then, one afternoon, I stumbled upon the first clue that something was undeniably wrong. It was an innocuous moment. I was cleaning out the home office, sorting through piles of papers and old files. Laura's laptop sat open on the desk, its screen black but still powered on. I bumped the mouse, and the screen lit up, revealing an email draft. The subject line read, "Tonight." The body of the email was empty, but it was addressed to Nathan Pierce. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to close the laptop and pretend I hadn't seen it. But the gnawing need for answers outweighed my fear. I scrolled through her sent folder, my hands trembling. There were no other emails to him, at least none that I could see. But the draft felt damning enough. That night, I lay awake beside her, my mind racing. If this was what I thought it was, I needed to know for sure. But how? How do you confront someone you love about something so devastating without breaking everything in the process? For now, I decided to wait. To watch, to gather pieces of the puzzle until the picture became clear. But deep down, I already knew. The cracks in our foundation were growing wider, and I wasn't sure if anything could hold us together anymore. Laura's late nights at the office became the new normal. I tried to distract myself with work, with hobbies, with anything that would keep my mind from circling back to that draft email. But nothing worked. Every time her phone buzzed with a notification, or she excused herself from the dinner table to take a call, my stomach churned with unease. One evening, she came home glowing. Not just the flush of exertion from a long day, but something deeper, something that made her eyes shine in a way I hadn't seen in months. She slipped her shoes off and leaned against the doorway, a small smile playing on her lips as she recounted her day. "Nathan came up with the most brilliant idea for the presentation," she said, almost breathless. "We've been stuck on this campaign for weeks, and he just cracked it. Honestly, it's going to change everything for the rollout." I forced a smile, nodding along. "Sounds like he's earning his paycheck." She laughed, a sound that cut through me like glass. It wasn't the laugh she used with me anymore. It was lighter, freer. "You should meet him again," she said, her voice bright. "I think you'd really like him." The words hung in the air like a dare. I wanted to respond, to say something that would bring us back to the way we used to be, but the moment passed too quickly. She moved to the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she poured a glass of wine. That's when I noticed the new necklace. A delicate silver chain with a small pendant, resting just above her collarbone. "New jewelry?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She touched the pendant reflexively, as though she hadn't realized it was there. "Oh, this? Just a little something I picked up. Do you like it?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it suits you." She smiled, but there was something guarded in her expression, a flicker of hesitation that made my chest tighten. The cracks in our marriage grew wider over the following weeks, but Laura seemed oblivious, or maybe she just didn't care. She was animated, vibrant in a way I hadn't seen in years. But it wasn't for me. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical, too. Her touch, once so familiar, now felt perfunctory, like a habit she no longer found comfort in. The turning point came during her company's annual retreat. Laura's firm rented out a sprawling estate in Napa, inviting the entire team to spend the weekend brainstorming, networking, and unwinding. She was ecstatic about it, packing with the kind of giddy energy she used to reserve for our vacations. "I'll be back Sunday night," she said as she kissed my cheek. "Don't wait up for me." The words stung more than they should have. It wasn't the first time she'd gone away for work, but this felt different. There was an edge to it, a finality that made my skin crawl. Sunday came and went, but Laura didn't come home until early Monday morning. When I asked about the delay, she waved it off with a breezy excuse about last-minute meetings and bad traffic. She seemed unfazed, but the smell of unfamiliar cologne lingered on her jacket, faint but unmistakable. I didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to Nathan Pierce. If he was the source of this growing chasm between us, I needed to understand why. I began researching him, combing through his LinkedIn profile, his professional history, even his social media. He was impressive, I had to admit. An Ivy League education, a string of successful projects, and a polished online persona that screamed confidence. But it was his Instagram that caught my attention. Among the carefully curated photos of tech conferences, sleek gadgets, and scenic shots from his travels, there were candid glimpses of his personal life. One image, in particular, stood out. It was a photo of a wine glass, half empty, on a wooden table. The caption read, "Late nights, deep conversations, and the perfect pairing." The date on the post matched the weekend of Laura's retreat. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, the pieces falling into place. It wasn't definitive proof, but it felt damning all the same. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but a part of me hesitated. If this was real, if my worst fears were true, there was no going back from it. That evening, Laura came home later than usual. She looked tired but content, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I watched her as she moved through the kitchen, her movements fluid and unhurried. When she turned to face me, I forced myself to speak. "How was the retreat?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Productive," she said, pouring herself a glass of water. Exhausting, but worth it. We got a lot done. I nodded, my throat tight. You and Nathan must have worked closely together. Her hand froze mid-air, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She set the glass down and gave me a curious look. Of course, she said lightly. He's the lead consultant. Why? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Just curious. You've been talking about him a lot. Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment, I thought she might say something, anything that would put my mind at ease. But instead, she turned away, her voice casual. Well, he's good at what he does. It's hard not to. I watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. The doubts that had been simmering for weeks were now boiling over, threatening to consume me. Something was happening between them, I was sure of it. And no matter how much I wanted to deny it, the truth was beginning to feel inescapable. The unraveling didn't come with a bang, but rather in whispers and glances that I wasn't supposed to notice. Laura's late nights stretched longer. Her excuses became less convincing, and my patience grew thin. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. Was I misreading her, seeing shadows where there was nothing? Or was this the gut-punch truth I had been avoiding? The final straw came one Thursday evening. Laura had told me she'd be late again. Another strategy meeting for her upcoming marketing campaign. I'd gotten used to eating dinner alone, pretending the quiet house didn't suffocate me. But that night, as I cleared the table, I noticed she'd left her laptop bag behind. Normally, I'd never touch her things. But tonight, my curiosity, no, my need for clarity, outweighed my respect for boundaries. I told myself I'd only check her calendar. Maybe she'd mentioned the meeting and I'd forgotten. But as I powered on her laptop, something else caught my attention. Her browser was still open, a map with a red pin marking a trendy rooftop bar downtown. The name was unfamiliar, but what struck me was the time on the screen. 7:30 p.m. It was already 7:15. My heart pounded as I stared at the glowing monitor, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a meeting location, it was something else entirely. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and jacket. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. Confront her? Watch from a distance? The thought of seeing her with him, because I knew, without a doubt, that it would be Nathan, was unbearable. But the not knowing was worse. The bar was exactly what I'd expected. Sleek, modern, and buzzing with energy. Couples leaned close over candlelit tables, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of music. I slipped inside, scanning the crowd with a mix of dread and determination. It didn't take long to spot them. Laura sat at a corner table, her face lit by the soft glow of hanging Edison bulbs. She looked beautiful, radiant in a way that made my chest ache. And then there was Nathan, leaning toward her with an ease that spoke of familiarity. They were laughing, their heads close, as if sharing a secret. I felt like an intruder in my own life, watching a scene that didn't belong to me. My fists clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to storm over, to demand answers, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I lingered in the shadows, my stomach twisting as I watched them. Then, as if sensing my presence, Laura glanced up. Her eyes widened, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. Nathan followed her gaze, turning to look at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition that made my blood boil. Laura stood quickly, smoothing her dress as she walked toward me. Her movements were rushed, her face a careful mask of calm. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with panic. I gestured toward the table behind her. "I could ask you the same thing." She glanced over her shoulder, as if to ensure Nathan wasn't listening, then turned back to me. "This isn't what you think," she said, her tone pleading. "Then what is it, Laura? Because it sure as hell looks like a date." My voice cracked, the anger barely held in check. Nathan remained seated, watching us with an air of detachment that only fueled my rage. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked amused, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "It's just business," Laura said, her eyes darting nervously between me and Nathan. "You're overreacting. Business," I scoffed, my voice rising. "You expect me to believe that?" Her face flushed, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me the truth. But instead, she doubled down. "You're being ridiculous. Can we talk about this at home?" I stared at her, searching for any sign of remorse, but all I saw was a carefully constructed wall. The woman I loved was slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. With a bitter laugh, I turned and walked out of the bar, leaving her standing there. A mix of frustration and guilt etched across her face. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, nursing a drink and replaying the scene over and over in my mind. Every laugh, every touch, every lingering glance felt like a knife to my chest. The confrontation hadn't brought me any clarity. If anything, it had only deepened the rift between us. When Laura finally came home, the tension between us was palpable. She moved through the house silently, her footsteps soft but heavy with unspoken words. I waited for her to say something, to offer an explanation, but she slipped into the bedroom without a word. I stayed on the couch that night, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a vice. The man she'd been with wasn't just some stranger. He was calculated, intentional, and worst of all, dangerously close. I didn't know how to fight this, how to compete with someone who seemed to offer her everything I couldn't. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The week after the confrontation at the bar was a blur of tension and silence. Laura and I spoke only when necessary, our conversations clipped and devoid of emotion. At night, she slept in the bedroom while I remained on the couch, the invisible wall between us growing taller with each passing day. My thoughts raced constantly, oscillating between anger, betrayal, and the faint hope that I had misunderstood everything. But that hope was crushed late one Friday evening. Laura came home unusually late, well past midnight. The sound of the front door opening stirred me from a restless sleep. I sat up, groggy but alert, as she stepped into the living room. Her hair was slightly tousled, her cheeks flushed, and the faint scent of Nathan's cologne, that same musky, intoxicating aroma, lingered in the air. "You're late," I said, my voice hoarse. She hesitated, her hand frozen on the strap of her bag. "I told you I'd be working late," she replied, her tone defensive. "It's almost 1 in the morning, Laura. This isn't just working late." Her eyes darted away, and she exhaled sharply. "I'm too tired for this right now." "Then when?" I stood, my voice rising despite myself. "When are you going to stop lying to me? When are you going to tell me the truth about what's going on?" "I'm not lying," she snapped, but the quiver in her voice betrayed her. She turned and started toward the hallway, but I stepped in her path. "Who is he, Laura?" I asked, my chest tight. "Just tell me." "Nathan?" Her silence spoke louder than words. She dropped her gaze, refusing to meet mine. The weight of her confirmation, silent, yet deafening, hit me like a sledgehammer. I stumbled back, the air knocked from my lungs. "How long?" I whispered. "It's not what you think," she said softly, her voice cracking. "It's complicated." I laughed bitterly. "Complicated? Is that what you call sneaking around with him behind my back?" She flinched, her shoulders trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "It started as work and then, I don't know, it got out of hand." "Out of hand," I repeated, my voice cold. "That's what you call cheating on your husband?" Laura's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. She looked at me with a mixture of guilt and desperation, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the emotional chasm between us. It wasn't just Nathan. This had been building for a long time, a slow erosion of trust and connection that neither of us had addressed. That night, she didn't sleep in the bedroom, nor did she stay in the living room with me. I heard her retreat to the guest room, the door clicking softly behind her. I sat in the dark for hours, the echoes of our argument replaying in my mind. My anger warred with a deep, aching sadness that I couldn't shake. The next day, I resolved to take some time for myself. I needed clarity, distance from the house that had become a battleground. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting the open road and the hum of the engine drown out my thoughts. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. And that's when I found the text. Laura's phone sat on the kitchen counter, forgotten in her haste to leave for the gym. The screen lit up with a notification as I passed by, catching my eye. It was a message from Nathan. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." The words burned into my brain, each one a dagger to my heart. My hands shook as I picked up the phone, scrolling through their thread. There were no explicit photos, no overt declarations of love, but the intimacy was unmistakable. The late-night meetups, the inside jokes, the plans for the next work trip, it was all there in black and white. The betrayal was complete. When Laura returned later that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. Her eyes widened when she saw me holding her phone. "What is this?" I demanded, holding up the screen. She froze, her face draining of color. "Where did you—" "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't make this about me invading your privacy. You've been lying to me for months. Do you even realize what you've done to us?" Her lips trembled as she stepped closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice breaking. "Over and over again. You chose him, Laura. Every time you texted him, met up with him, lied to my face. You chose him." She collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. For the first time, I saw her as human, flawed and broken. But it didn't lessen the pain. If anything, it deepened it because the woman I loved was still there, but she wasn't mine anymore. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I can't do this right now." Laura nodded, her sobs muffled against her palms. And as I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with her guilt, I wondered if time would ever be enough to heal the wound she'd left in my heart. The days that followed were a mixture of anger and silence. Laura and I navigated the house like strangers, our routines interwoven yet entirely separate. There were moments when I thought she might reach out, might try to explain or repair the damage, but those moments never came. Instead, she seemed to retreat further into herself, her expressions vacant, her words few. I, too, buried my feelings beneath a mountain of distractions. Work, errands, anything to avoid confronting the gaping wound in our relationship. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, Nathan's presence loomed like a specter over every waking moment. It was a Wednesday evening when the dam finally broke. Laura had just come home, her steps hesitant, her shoulders weighed down by an invisible burden. She dropped her purse on the counter and stood there, staring at nothing in particular. I watched her from the couch, the tension between us thick enough to choke on. "We need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she looked almost relieved, as though she'd been waiting for this confrontation. She nodded slowly and crossed the room, sitting in the armchair opposite me. "Okay," she said softly. "I'm listening." I struggled to find the right words, my thoughts a jumble of hurt and anger. Finally, I settled on the one question that had haunted me since this all began. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why him? Why now?" Laura's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absent-mindedly. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "It wasn't planned. I didn't go looking for it. But it happened," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "You made it happen. You made choices, Laura. You chose him." She flinched, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I know that doesn't make it better, but it's the truth." Her words did little to soothe the ache in my chest. If anything, they only deepened it. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, and stared at the floor. "Do you love him?" I asked, the question tasting bitter on my tongue. Laura's breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she nodded, her voice barely audible. I don't know. Maybe. It's different with him. The words hung in the air like a death knell. I felt my heart shatter all over again, the pieces grinding together in my chest. I stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. Different? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Well, that's one way to describe it. Laura's tears spilled over, but she didn't try to stop me as I walked out of the room. I needed space, air, anything to escape the suffocating weight of her confession. In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece together the remnants of my life. Laura and I coexisted in a state of uneasy truce, neither of us willing to address the growing void between us. She continued her late nights at work, though now I knew exactly where she was and who she was with. One evening, as I sat in my car outside her office, the lights of the building casting long shadows across the parking lot, I saw them together. Nathan stood beside her car, his hand resting lightly on her arm. They were laughing, their faces lit with an ease that I hadn't seen in years. My stomach churned, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, debating whether to confront them then and there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the realization that I had nothing left to say. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of what their relationship meant for the future. It was during one of these late nights that I decided to confront Nathan directly. I found his email address through a company directory and drafted a message that was equal parts measured and furious. Nathan, I'm sure you know who I am by now. I'd like to meet with you, face to face. No more hiding behind texts and late-night rendezvous. Let's put everything out in the open. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Café Luna. Be there. I hesitated for a moment before hitting send, unsure if this was the right move. But as the message disappeared into the ether, I felt a strange sense of calm. I didn't know what I hoped to accomplish, but I needed to face him, to understand the man who had dismantled my marriage piece by piece. The next evening, I arrived at the cafe early, my nerves buzzing with anticipation. I didn't have to wait long. Nathan walked in 10 minutes later, his confident stride and casual demeanor infuriatingly familiar. He spotted me immediately and made his way over, his expression unreadable. You wanted to talk, he said, sliding into the chair opposite me. I studied him for a moment, searching for the cracks in his facade. But if he felt any guilt or remorse, he hid it well. What do you want from her? I asked, my voice low but steady. Is this just some game to you? Nathan leaned back, his lips curving into a faint smirk. It's not a game, he said. I care about Laura. Maybe more than you do. The audacity of his words made my blood boil. I leaned forward, my fists clenching on the table. You don't know anything about me or our marriage, I said through gritted teeth. Maybe not, he admitted, shrugging. But I know what she wants. And it's not this. He gestured vaguely, as if dismissing me and everything we'd built together. His words cut deeper than I cared to admit, but I refused to let him see it. Instead, I stared him down, my voice cold and firm. You'll never be more than a phase to her, and when she realizes that, you'll be nothing. For the first time, Nathan's smirk faltered. But before he could respond, I stood and walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. The battle wasn't over, but I was done playing by his rules. The confrontation with Nathan left me simmering with unresolved anger. His smug demeanor, his dismissal of my marriage as a passing phase, haunted me. But more than the anger, there was a creeping sense of helplessness. He was young, confident, and embedded in Laura's life in a way I no longer seemed to be. How had it come to this? I tried to focus on my work, burying myself in projects and deadlines, but even there, I couldn't escape him. Laura's world and mine were beginning to overlap in ways I couldn't control. I started noticing subtle shifts at home. Emails on her laptop left open to Nathan's name, a faint trace of his cologne on her scarf. It wasn't just their relationship anymore. It was his encroachment into every corner of my life. One night, as I sat in my office reviewing some files, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Laura, except it wasn't addressed to me. It had been forwarded by accident, a thread between her and Nathan. From Nathan, I've been working on this new system, something that can dig into personal accounts. Nothing illegal, of course, just an edge. Could make things easier for us. I read it 3 times, the meaning sinking in like lead. Nathan was prying into my life, my accounts. I immediately checked my banking app, my emails, and my social media accounts, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. And that's when I found it. My email outbox had a message I hadn't written, sent to Laura 2 days earlier. Subject: I can't do this anymore, body. I've been thinking about everything, and I realize this marriage isn't working. Maybe it's time we both moved on. The bile rose in my throat. He was trying to destroy us, framing me as the villain in his twisted narrative. My mind raced with possibilities. Could Laura believe it? Was this his way of isolating her, painting me as the aggressor while he played the savior? The walls seemed to close in as I paced the room, my fists clenching and unclenching. I wanted to confront Laura immediately, but something stopped me. If she had already seen the email, if she had already started to believe him, a confrontation might only push her closer to him. Instead, I decided to fight fire with fire. The next day, I called in a favor from an old friend, Alex, who worked in cybersecurity. He owed me one from years ago, and I knew he'd keep this quiet. I explained the situation as vaguely as possible, skirting around the infidelity and focusing on the hacking. Can you trace the source? I asked. Find out what he's done and how far he's gone. Alex hesitated. It depends. If he's good, covering his tracks, it might take time. But if he's sloppy, there'll be breadcrumbs. Let me see what I can do. Hours stretched into days as Alex worked. Meanwhile, I kept up the charade at home. Laura and I were barely speaking, the distance between us palpable. I didn't ask about Nathan, and she didn't volunteer any information. But every moment of silence felt like a countdown to something inevitable. On the 3rd day, Alex called. You were right, he said, his voice grim. Your guy's been digging into everything. Emails, social media, even your financial records. He's using software that masks his activity, but it's not perfect. I traced a few of his logins to Laura's company's server. My stomach twisted. So he's doing this on site? Looks like it. And he's been sending emails under your name. A few to Laura, but also one to someone at your office. A woman named Erin. I froze. Erin was my colleague, someone I'd worked with closely on several projects. We were friendly but strictly professional. What did he send? Alex hesitated. It's bad. He made it look like you've been inappropriate with her. Suggestive messages. If she's seen them, she might think you're harassing her. My pulse thundered in my ears. Nathan wasn't just trying to destroy my marriage. He was dismantling my entire life. That night, I barely slept. My mind churned with anger and fear. If Erin reported the emails, if Laura continued to trust Nathan, everything I'd built could come crashing down. Couldn't let him win. The following day, I drove to Laura's office. My heart pounded as I parked across the street, watching the entrance. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw him. Nathan. He emerged from the building, his casual confidence radiating like a toxic cloud. But this time he wasn't alone. A security guard walked beside him, their conversation tense. As they reached the curb, the guard grabbed Nathan's arm. A moment later, 2 more guards appeared, their expressions stern. Nathan's confidence wavered as they escorted him back inside. I didn't know what had happened, but I hoped it was the beginning of his undoing. Later that evening, Laura came home looking shaken. She didn't speak to me immediately, but the weight of her thoughts was evident in her expression. Finally, as I sat at the kitchen table, she approached. Nathan was fired today, she said, her voice trembling. There were allegations about him using company resources for personal gain. They think he hacked into some accounts, but he's denying everything. I nodded, masking my relief. Did you know? Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. I didn't. I swear I didn't. I knew he was ambitious, but I never thought he'd. She trailed off, tears spilling down her cheeks. I wanted to comfort her, but the pain of her betrayal still burned too deeply. Instead, I sat silently, letting her tears fill the void between us. Nathan's actions might have been exposed, but the damage he'd caused remained, and it was far from over. Nathan's sudden dismissal from Laura's company was the spark that lit a fuse I hadn't anticipated. In the days that followed, Laura became a shadow of herself. She spoke little, her once steady confidence shaken. I wanted to feel vindicated, triumphant even, but instead, I was left with an oppressive weight that I couldn't shake. The house was heavy with silence one evening when Laura approached me, her face pale and drawn. She sat on the couch across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The phrase had become a refrain in our unraveling marriage, but this time, something in her tone stopped me. I set down the book I wasn't really reading and gave her my full attention. "Go ahead," I said, my voice flat. She hesitated, her eyes flitting to the floor. "There are things I haven't told you. About Nathan." The mention of his name sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me, but I bit it back, forcing myself to remain calm. "What things?" Her lips trembled as she began to speak. "He wasn't just someone I worked with. He was obsessed. At first, I thought it was harmless. He'd stay late to help with projects, make little jokes, compliment me in ways that felt innocent. But then it changed. Changed how? I asked, leaning forward. "He started following me," she said, her voice breaking. "Not just at work, but outside of it. He'd show up at places I hadn't told him about. And then there were the messages, hundreds of them, on my work email, my personal phone. At first, they were sweet, but then they became possessive, demanding." My jaw tightened, my hands clenching into fists. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I thought I could handle it," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want to worry you, and part of me felt responsible. I thought I'd encouraged it somehow, that it was my fault." Her confession felt like a slap to the face. "Did you?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. Laura's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I don't know. Maybe. I flirted back sometimes, I won't lie, but I never wanted it to go this far." Her words cut deep, reopening the wounds that had barely begun to scab over. I stood abruptly, pacing the room in an attempt to process what she just told me. "So all this time, you've been letting him get closer," I said, my voice shaking. "You've been lying to me while he's what? Stalked you? Hacked me? Tried to ruin my career." "I didn't know about the hacking," she said quickly. "I swear, I only found out after he was fired. I thought he was just infatuated, not dangerous." I turned to face her, my anger giving way to a cold, steely resolve. "He's more than dangerous, Laura. He's a predator, and you let him into our lives." Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But the betrayal still burned too brightly for me to extend any comfort. Instead, I sat down, running a hand through my hair as I tried to formulate a plan. The following morning, I called Alex again, explaining the new information Laura had revealed. He listened intently, then promised to dig deeper into Nathan's digital footprint. Meanwhile, I took steps to secure our home, changing passwords, installing security cameras, and alerting our bank to monitor any suspicious activity. Laura seemed grateful for the precautions, but the distance between us remained. She spent most of her time holed up in the guest room, emerging only for meals or to make tense, stilted conversation. I wanted to ask her more about Nathan, about the depth of their relationship, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. It wasn't until 3 days later that Alex called with an update. His voice was grim. "You were right to be worried," he said. "Nathan's not just some lovesick tech guy. He's been digging into everything, not just your accounts but Laura's too. And there's more." "What do you mean, more?" I asked, my heart pounding. "He's been tracking her movements through her phone's GPS," Alex said. "He has access to her calendar, her emails, even her private photos. He's built a complete profile of her life. And he's been using that information to manipulate both of you. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Manipulate how? Alex hesitated. Those emails he sent under your name? They weren't just meant to drive a wedge between you and Laura. He's also been using them to frame you as abusive. There are fake text messages, fabricated threats, and even a police report filed under your name. The room spun around me. A police report? It hasn't gone anywhere yet, Alex said quickly. But it's there waiting. If he wanted to, he could use it to completely ruin you. Rage bubbled up inside me, white-hot and uncontrollable. Nathan wasn't just trying to steal my wife. He was trying to obliterate my entire existence. Can you stop him? I asked, my voice shaking. I can try, Alex said. But he's smart. If I'm not careful, he'll know I'm on to him. I thanked Alex and hung up, my mind racing. I needed to act quickly, but I also needed to be careful. Nathan was playing a dangerous game, and if I wasn't careful, he'd win. That evening, I sat Laura down and told her everything Alex had uncovered. Her face went pale as I spoke, her hands trembling as she listened. When I finished, she looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What do we do?" she whispered. I met her gaze, my resolve hardening. We fight back. Together. The air in the house felt heavy with unspoken words as Laura and I moved through the next few days. The plan we had devised was simple in concept but fraught with risk. We needed to expose Nathan for who he was before he could use his manipulations to destroy us. But even as we worked together, the emotional scars between us remained. Trust, once broken, wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It began with Laura reaching out to Nathan. She texted him, a simple message, "I need to see you." His response was immediate, as if he'd been waiting for her to cave. "Anytime. Name the place." We decided on a neutral location. A small cafe downtown, far enough from her office that it wouldn't draw attention. Laura insisted on going alone, a decision that made my stomach churn, but I understood her reasoning. Nathan needed to believe she was still under his spell, that she was coming to him willingly. Meanwhile, Alex would monitor the meeting from a discreet distance, ready to capture any evidence of Nathan's manipulation. The morning of the meeting, Laura dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and slacks that conveyed professionalism but not intimacy. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her necklace, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, determined, and deeply human. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice low. She met my gaze in the mirror, her eyes glistening. "I have to be. For us." I nodded, my chest tightening with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Be careful." I parked a block away from the cafe, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched her walk inside. Alex was already in place, seated near the back of the room with a laptop open in front of him. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The tension in Laura's posture as she sat across from Nathan told me everything. He leaned in, his expression one of practiced charm, but there was an undercurrent of control in the way he gestured, the way his eyes darted around the room. Laura nodded at intervals, her face carefully neutral, but I could see the strain in her smile. After 20 agonizing minutes, Laura excused herself, heading toward the restroom. Alex followed her cue, slipping outside to meet me. "He's suspicious," Alex said, his voice low, "but he's also overconfident. He thinks she's coming back to him." "Did you get anything?" Alex nodded, holding up a small recording device. "Plenty. Enough to prove he's been stalking her and using her credentials to access restricted systems. We can take this to the authorities." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over yet. Nathan wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Laura and I sat together in the living room, the recording playing softly between us. Nathan's voice was smooth, calculated, but his words dripped with entitlement. "You don't belong with him," he said. "You're better than that. You're better with me. Don't you see that?" My hands curled into fists as I listened, the raw arrogance of his tone igniting a fire in my chest. But Laura's reaction was quieter. She stared at the floor, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of everything had finally become too much. "It's over," she whispered. "I'll never let him control me again." Her words were resolute, but I could hear the exhaustion beneath them. She had been caught in Nathan's web for months, and breaking free wouldn't erase the damage he'd done. To her, to me, to us. The next day, we took the evidence to the police. Alex had compiled everything. The recordings, the emails, the fabricated documents Nathan had created. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing darker as the full extent of Nathan's actions came to light. "We'll open an investigation immediately," one of them assured us. "This isn't the first time we've seen someone like him, but with the evidence you've provided, we have a strong case." It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. As we left the station, Laura turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. The scars Nathan had left weren't just on her. They were on both of us. And while exposing him was a step toward healing, it didn't erase the choices Laura had made, the trust she had broken. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I want to try." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Me too." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. The days following Nathan's exposure were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, tense conversations, and a profound reckoning of the state of my marriage. Despite the small victory of seeing Nathan face accountability for his actions, the cracks in Laura's and my relationship remained painfully visible. Nathan's arrest made headlines, his polished reputation unraveling in the public eye. Laura's company issued a statement condemning his behavior, and he was charged with multiple counts, including cyberstalking, fraud, and harassment. Yet, even as he faced justice, I couldn't shake the lingering bitterness. His actions had been a catalyst, but they weren't the root of our problems. The root had always been us. Laura and I tried to piece things together, but every conversation felt strained, every attempt at intimacy forced. The shadow of her affair loomed over every interaction, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had fractured our trust. Counseling sessions brought some clarity but no resolution. Each session ended with us further apart, the realization sinking in that love alone wasn't enough. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, our designated space for the hard conversations, Laura finally said what I'd been dreading. "I think we need to stop fighting this," she said softly, her hands clasped around a mug of untouched tea. "We're holding on to something that's already gone." I stared at her, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I had expected this moment, but expecting it didn't make it any easier. "You're giving up," I said, my voice low. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, I'm being honest. We've been broken for a long time, even before Nathan. I don't think we can fix this, and trying is only hurting us more." The truth in her words was undeniable, but it didn't make it any less painful. I nodded slowly, the weight of her admission settling over me. "So what now?" "We end it," she said, her voice trembling. "On our terms. Amicably. For both our sakes." The divorce process was as civil as it could be under the circumstances. We agreed to split our assets evenly, avoiding the drawn-out battles that often accompanied these proceedings. Laura insisted on keeping the house, a decision I didn't contest. It was too full of memories, both good and bad, for me to stay. My lawyer, a sharp and pragmatic woman named Dana, guided me through the process with efficiency. "You're handling this well," she said during one meeting, her tone almost surprised. "There's no point in making it uglier than it needs to be," I replied. But the truth was, I was too drained to fight. All I wanted was to close this chapter and move forward. The day of the final hearing came faster than I expected. Laura and I sat side by side in the courtroom, a stark contrast to the couples around us who hurled accusations and demands with venomous intensity. When the judge finalized the divorce, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. It was over, officially, legally, and completely over. Outside the courthouse, Laura turned to me, her expression a mixture of regret and something resembling hope. "For what it's worth," she said. "I'm sorry. For everything." I studied her for a moment, searching for the anger I thought I'd feel. But it wasn't there. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. "I'm sorry too," I said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But love, I'd learned, wasn't always enough to save something that had been broken for too long. In the weeks after the divorce, I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I filled my days with work, reconnecting with old friends, and exploring hobbies I'd neglected during my marriage. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. One evening, as I stood on the small balcony overlooking the city, my phone buzzed with a message from Alex. "He's taken a plea deal. 5 years minimum. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at the message for a long time, the reality of Nathan's downfall sinking in. It felt like closure, but it didn't erase the scars he'd left. Still, knowing he couldn't hurt anyone else brought a sense of peace. Months turned into a year, and life moved on. I started dating again, cautiously at first, unsure if I was ready to open myself up to someone new. But with time, I realized that the pain of my past didn't have to define my future. I could heal, I could rebuild, and I could find happiness again. Laura and I rarely spoke, our lives diverging completely. The few times we did cross paths, it was polite but distant, as though we were acquaintances rather than two people who had once shared everything. And perhaps that was for the best. Some things, once shattered, couldn't be pieced back together. But as I stood on the threshold of this new chapter in my life, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. Hope for a future free of betrayal and pain. Hope for a fresh start. Hope for a love that wouldn't break. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.